60 years of silence ended in a single vote. For more than half a century, Burkina Faso lived in a peculiar legal twilight, a nation where same-sex relations were neither celebrated nor condemned, suspended in the quiet margins of the law. But in September 2025, that silence was broken with a unanimous decision by the Transitional Parliament. Acts once left unspoken were now punishable by prison. What seemed an isolated act of legislation revealed itself as part of a continental wave, echoing from Kampala to Bamako, from Accra to Ouagadougou. This is not only about law, this is about sovereignty. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward to lead the nation after years of instability, he carried more than military authority. He carried a promise that the future of Burkina Faso would be written at home, not dictated from abroad. The law against homosexuality is woven into that promise, controversial to outsiders, but defended at home as a reflection of culture, faith, and identity. Do not look away. What follows is more than a headline. It is the story of a continent speaking in its own voice. Stay with us, subscribe, and walk with us into the heart of Africa's turning point. Burkina Faso's story did not begin with fanfare. It began with silence, a silence that stretched across more than 6 decades. When the nation gained independence from France in 1960, its legal code contained no articles criminalizing same-sex relations. Unlike its neighbors shaped by British colonial penal codes, Ouagadougou inherited an absence, a gap, a space where law remained neutral. For 60 years, that silence endured. It was not acceptance, nor was it open defiance. It was simply a quiet omission that gave Burkina Faso an unusual place on Africa's legal map. Yet silence has weight. For generations, Burkinabe families lived within cultural and religious frameworks that condemned homosexuality in private conversations and in the moral teachings of churches and mosques. The state might not have taken a stance, but society had already drawn its lines. The absence of prohibition in law did not mean freedom on the streets. Same-sex couples could not walk hand in hand under the Sahelian sun without consequence, not from the courts, but from the gaze of their neighbors. This fragile balance shifted in 2024. The transitional government, led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, introduced a draft amendment to the family code. For the first time, the word homosexuality entered the language of criminal law in Burkina Faso. It was as if the silence of decades had been cracked open, allowing old cultural sentiments to flow into official policy. The draft was met with little surprise inside the nation. Many considered it overdue. But it captured international attention, for Burkina Faso had been one of the few exceptions on the continent. That exception ended in September 2025. The Transitional Parliament convened in Ouagadougou and voted unanimously to outlaw homosexual acts. Not one dissenting voice was recorded. The new law prescribed prison terms of 2 to 5 years, financial fines, and deportation for foreigners. Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya defended the legislation in stark terms, describing homosexuality as bizarre behavior that threatened social cohesion. His words resonated deeply in a country where more than 90% of citizens identify with a religion, either Islam or Christianity, and where traditional customs reinforce collective morality. To the outside observer, this was a sudden reversal. A nation once marked by neutrality had leapt decisively into the camp of prohibition. But to insiders, it was not a revolution. It was a codification of what had long existed in the moral order of society. The state, after decades of neutrality, finally aligned with the pulpit, the family table, and the community gathering. What had once been unspoken was now written in law. The significance cannot be overstated. Burkina Faso's decision marked the end of its exceptional status and confirmed its participation in a broader continental movement. From Uganda's draconian law in 2023 to Nigeria's enduring restrictions to debates in Ghana and Mali, Africa was shifting. Burkina Faso's unanimous vote did not stand alone. It joined a pattern of legislation that reflected a deeper undercurrent, a desire for sovereignty, for cultural affirmation, for independence from external judgment. For Ibrahim Traoré, the law carried symbolic weight. His government had already expelled French troops, sought military partnerships with Mali and Niger, and tightened bonds with Russia and China. Sovereignty was the banner under which he rallied his people. The criminalization of homosexuality was thus not an isolated policy. It was a chapter in a larger book, one that proclaimed decisions about our society will be made here, not in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. But questions remain. Why now? Why at this exact moment after more than 60 years of silence? Was this purely a reflection of cultural values, or also a political calculation designed to consolidate power and unify the population under a moral cause? Could the silence of the past have continued without disruption? Or was this break inevitable in the storm of continental change? The silence has ended. Burkina Faso has spoken. The words are written in law. The question is no longer whether the nation will remain neutral, but where this decisive step will lead. And that is where the story turns. From the silence of the past to the uproar of reaction, both within the Sahel and across the globe. The chamber in Ouagadougou was silent before the vote, but the outcome left no doubt. Every hand was raised, every voice aligned. Unanimity, a rare and powerful force in politics, carried the day. Burkina Faso's transitional parliament did not simply pass a law, it delivered a verdict. For the first time in the nation's history, homosexuality was defined as a criminal offense, and the state declared openly what society had long whispered. The quiet neutrality of 60 years was replaced with a clear and irreversible stance. The high point of this moment was not only the vote itself, but the language surrounding it. Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya stepped forward and described same-sex relations as bizarre behavior. The phrase echoed through the chamber, not as a novel invention, but as an articulation of what many Burkinabés already believed. In a country where religious life is woven into the rhythm of daily existence, his words were not shocking. They were familiar. They mirrored sermons in mosques, homilies in churches, and conversations at family gatherings. The law was not leading society, it was following it. On the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was a mixture of pride and certainty. Supporters saw the vote as an affirmation of cultural identity, a defense of traditions that stretch back generations. For them, the unanimous decision symbolized unity at a time when insecurity and economic hardship threatened to fragment the nation. Here was proof, they argued, that Burkina Faso could still stand together on moral ground, but applause at home was accompanied by alarm abroad. International news outlets reported the story with headlines framing Burkina Faso as the latest country to roll back human rights. Commentators in Washington and Brussels spoke of potential sanctions. Advocacy groups warned that loans and aid could be withheld, repeating patterns seen in Uganda after its controversial law in 2023. To global institutions, the vote was not a sign of sovereignty, but of regression. Neighboring states, however, offered a different perspective. In Bamako, officials recalled Mali's own path towards prohibition and expressed solidarity. In Ghana, where Parliament continued to debate restrictions, Burkina Faso's decision was seen as validation that the winds of change were continental, not isolated. Across Nigeria and Uganda, the law was interpreted as a reaffirmation of shared values rather than an anomaly. Far from being a lonely step, Burkina Faso was marching in rhythm with the Sahel and beyond. This continental resonance elevated the moment into a climax. The unanimous vote was not just a legal shift, but a symbolic declaration. Africa was speaking, not in scattered voices, but in a chorus. In that chorus, Burkina Faso sang loudly. Yet the celebration inside the nation masked deeper questions. What would this mean for the country's fragile international relationships? Could Burkina Faso withstand economic penalties or diplomatic isolation? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the gamble was clear. By embracing a cause rooted in culture and faith, he strengthened his image as a defender of sovereignty. But he also invited confrontation with the powerful institutions that hold financial leverage over the Sahel. The law's passage was, therefore, both triumph and risk. It brought cohesion at home while igniting tension abroad. The chamber's unanimous vote was a high note in Burkina Faso's political drama, but it was also the opening of a new and uncertain act. As the applause faded inside the parliament, the echo of criticism grew louder outside, and the question became unavoidable. What consequences would follow this act of defiance? The passage of Burkina Faso's new law reverberated beyond the walls of parliament. For ordinary citizens, it quickly translated into changes in the social climate. In neighborhoods across Ouagadougou, in the villages of the Sahel, conversations shifted. What had once been taboo, mentioned only in whispers, was now debated openly. For some, the law brought a sense of moral order, a reassurance that the state was listening to cultural instincts. For others, especially those who lived quietly on the margins, it brought fear. What had been tolerated in silence was now punishable by imprisonment. The legal change gave communities a renewed sense of collective identity. In churches and mosques, sermons framed the law as a victory for tradition, a restoration of moral balance. Families expressed relief that their values had been recognized in official form. For many Burkinabés, it was as if the government had put into writing what they had always believed. Yet within this celebration, there was also anxiety. Human rights groups warned of rising discrimination, and private individuals whispered concerns that suspicion alone could lead to persecution. Society, already conservative, was now backed by the force of law. Politically, the impact was immediate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, already known for expelling French troops and championing a new Sahelian alliance, solidified his position as a leader unafraid to reflect the will of his people. His image as a man of sovereignty grew stronger. The unanimous vote in parliament was seen as proof that even in transition, Burkina Faso could act with unity. To his supporters, this was not just leadership, it was legacy. The decision became part of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, a testament to his willingness to challenge international norms in order to uphold domestic values. Yet politics is never only about symbolism. Critics argued that the law distracted from more pressing issues: an escalating insurgency in the north, fragile infrastructure, and deep poverty. By focusing national energy on moral questions, the government risked diverting attention from battles against armed groups and economic hardship. Some suggested that legislation like this functioned as a rallying point, uniting the nation around a cultural cause while the underlying crises remained unresolved. Economically, the stakes were high. Burkina Faso's dependence on aid and loans left it vulnerable to international reprisal. Rights organizations hinted that sanctions or the suspension of development funds could follow, echoing the treatment of Uganda in 2023. For a nation struggling with insecurity and limited resources, the threat of financial penalties loomed heavily. At the same time, the government's pivot towards alliances with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China suggested an alternative path, one less dependent on Western institutions. Among ordinary citizens, there was a mix of pride and unease. Some voiced that the law affirmed who they were as a people, that it gave dignity to their traditions. Others worried that the country might be walking into isolation, trading short-term solidarity for long-term vulnerability. Conversations in markets and cafes reflected the tension: sovereignty on one hand, survival on the other. The consequences were thus layered. Socially, the law reinforced conservative norms and reshaped public discourse. Politically, it enhanced Traoré's standing and gave his government a unifying cause. Economically, it risked confrontation with powerful institutions while opening the door to alternative alliances. But beneath all these consequences lies a central question, one that only time will answer. Has Burkina Faso secured its moral foundation, or has it built a fragile wall that could crack under the weight of global pressure? The answer may not lie within Ouagadougou alone, but in the reactions of foreign capitals. For the world was already preparing its response. The unanimous vote in Ouagadougou did not echo in silence. It traveled across oceans and into the corridors of international institutions. In Brussels, statements of concern were issued within hours, framing Burkina Faso's decision as a setback for human rights. In Washington, officials spoke cautiously of reviewing partnerships, a phrase that has often preceded the suspension of aid. The United Nations and the World Bank raised familiar questions about compliance with global norms, hinting that development assistance might not flow as easily as before. From a Western perspective, Burkina Faso had joined a dangerous trend. Reports described the law as part of a backlash against liberal values. Advocacy groups mobilized campaigns urging sanctions, drawing parallels with Uganda, which faced international penalties in 2023 after adopting one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws in the world. For many global observers, the unanimous vote was a symbol not of unity, but of regression. Yet across Africa, the tone was different. Leaders in Mali and Niger expressed open solidarity, framing Burkina Faso's law as a defense of cultural sovereignty. In Ghana and Nigeria, debates intensified, fueled by the knowledge that Ouagadougou had already crossed the line. To them, Burkina Faso was not an outlier, but a fellow traveler in a wider continental movement. Beyond Africa, Burkina Faso sought new partners. Ties with Russia and China grew stronger, not only through military and economic cooperation, but through political alignment. For these powers, sovereignty was a key word, and interference in domestic law was denounced as neo-colonial behavior. The Sahel's new alliances thus provided Burkina Faso with breathing space, a shield against the immediate pressures of Western institutions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself framed the decision within a broader vision. It was not merely about regulating private life, but about defining the future of the nation. This is where the phrase Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 gained resonance. The vision was one of a Burkina Faso and a Sahel that would chart its own path, relying on regional solidarity and non-Western partnerships rather than conditional aid. Whether in law, security, or economics, the message was consistent. Africa must decide for itself. The international response, therefore, revealed a collision of worldviews. For some, Burkina Faso had turned away from progress. For others, it had taken a courageous step towards independence. The law became a fault line, exposing the deep divide between global standards and local sovereignty. But the question remained, could this defiance sustain itself in the long run, or would the weight of economic pressure and diplomatic isolation prove too heavy to bear? The law has been passed, but the story is not finished. Burkina Faso now stands at a crossroads, its path shaped by choices that will echo far beyond the borders of Ouagadougou. The first scenario is one of confrontation. International institutions may tighten financial screws, suspend aid, or restrict access to loans. For a country already struggling with insurgency and poverty, such measures could cut deep. The burden would fall not only on government officials, but on ordinary families, reminding the nation that sovereignty often carries a price. The second scenario is one of solidarity. Burkina Faso has drawn closer to Mali and Niger, its partners in the Sahel. Together, these nations have declared that their futures will no longer be dictated by Paris or Washington. If this alliance deepens, they may find strength in numbers, creating a regional shield against external pressure. With Russia and China offering support, the Sahel could move towards a new model, one where survival depends less on Western aid and more on South-South cooperation. The third scenario is one of reform. The law may be a symbol of sovereignty, but sovereignty alone cannot feed children or build schools. For the vision to endure, Burkina Faso will need to invest in agriculture, infrastructure, and education. The real test of independence will not be the rejection of external pressure, but the building of internal resilience. In each path, risk and opportunity coexist. Sovereignty is never a simple declaration. It is a long road paved with struggle, compromise, and determination. The law against homosexuality has become a marker on that road, a signal that Burkina Faso is willing to endure controversy to defend its cultural foundations. Yet the harvest of this choice will only be seen in the years ahead. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the stakes are high. He has positioned himself as a leader of defiance, a symbol of the Sahel's awakening. If Burkina Faso can navigate the turbulence and emerge stronger, his name will be remembered as a builder of independence. If not, critics will claim that the pursuit of sovereignty came at too great a cost. The seeds have been planted, but will they grow into a harvest of dignity or into weeds of isolation? Only the future will decide. Burkina Faso's unanimous vote was more than the passage of a law. It was a declaration that the silence of 6 decades would no longer define the nation, that sovereignty is not granted by outsiders, but claimed by those who dare to speak in their own voice. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this moment is woven into his story, part of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy that he is writing with each decision. He has expelled foreign troops, redefined alliances, and now reshaped the moral framework of his country. Yet the law itself is not the end. It is a symbol, a mirror reflecting deeper struggles between culture and global expectation, between community identity and individual freedom. For some, it is a step backwards. For others, it is a step towards dignity. What cannot be denied is that it forces the world to confront a question long avoided. Who has the right to set the moral compass of a nation? In envisioning the road ahead, Traoré speaks not only to the present, but to the future. His Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 seeks a Sahel free from dependency, a continent that builds prosperity through its own hands rather than borrowed scripts. This vision is bold, but it is fragile, for sovereignty is not sustained by words alone, but by the patient labor of building schools, industries, and bridges of trust within and beyond borders. The legacy of this moment will be measured not by today's applause or tomorrow's condemnation, but by whether Burkina Faso can stand tall in the storms of global politics. Twice now we have invoked the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, and rightly so, for his choices are carving lines in the history of Africa's independence. The question for us all is simple yet profound. Can Africa's future be written in its own ink, or will it always be judged by standards it did not choose? If you believe these questions matter, do not look away. Share this story, leave your voice in the comments, and subscribe to walk with us on the long road of Africa's unfolding history.